We are now continuing with chapter number 6. Here we go. Chapter number 6. The same is true pertaining to the blowing of the shofar Rosh Hashanah. That the shofar now causes pleasure throughout the entire world, and this pleasure derives from the source of all pleasure, the level of Mokar Hatanugim, which is higher than the level of revealed pleasure. For Rosh Hashanah, everything returns back to its source, and therefore God needs to renew everything from the very beginning and its first initiation. Everything returns back to the essence of God, to the highest level. And this applies also to the covenant that each and every one of us has with Almighty God on Rosh Hashanah. The day of Rosh Hashanah, we enter into a covenant, into a promise, into an agreement, into a pact with Almighty God that we are going to accept Him as King, and therefore we're going to follow all of His commandments. It's a new pact. What happened last year happened last year. Now it's all over. Starting anew on Rosh Hashanah. And this covenant between God and the Jewish people. Every year, Rosh Hashanah, this covenant and this connection and this commitment is made again from new. But it says in the Torah itself. In the Torah itself, we are told the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. We read the portion on Nitzavim. Over there it says, Atem Nitzavim Hayoim. It says in the Torah, today we're standing before God, to pass through the covenant of God, your Lord. In other words, every single person, man, woman, and child on Rosh Hashanah enter into this new covenant with God. As we know in general, that a bris, that a covenant, is a connection and an agreement that is beyond logic. It's not contingent on if it makes sense. It's not contingent if I'm healthy. It's not contingent if I am in a good mood. No, this is the bris. Unconditionally, I will do all the laws of God, and God unconditionally will give us everything we need: material health, material money, spiritual health, spiritual money, etc., etc. This is indicated and underscored by the two famous parables of the blowing of the shofar, which is brought down in the Maamarim of the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Shmuel of Lubavitcher. And now the Rebbe goes on to give these two mishalim in short, in brief, and we are going to elaborate on it a bit. Mashal Echad, the first Mashal B'Shem Baal Shem Tov, the name of the Baal Shem Tov is Ben Melech, dealing with the son of a king, by the fact that he calls out with a simple voice. The king knows that this is the voice of his son, and even though he doesn't use the language of the king, this now renews the relationship between the king and the son. What is the mashal? What is the parable? A beautiful parable of the Baal Shem Tov, that a king has an only son and sends out the son to a foreign country to learn the sciences and the nature and the wisdom and the teachings of the other countries. He wants the child to explore the world and become intelligent and wise and mature. And what happens is the king gives him money to spend and to be able to survive. He spends all his money on what we call narishkeit, on things that are not that important. And he becomes very, very involved with the other nations and confused. He forgets his source, he forgets where he comes from, and he forgets his mother tongue. He's learning now the languages of the natives, of the other countries. He now comes back home penniless, and he hardly any food, and his clothing are tattered. He looks like a shlamazel. He looks like a pauper. And he comes to the border and says, "Let me in. I want to go see my father, the king." However, the guards have no idea what he's talking about. He does not know their language. He begins to cry. He says, "Daddy, Daddy, save me." But he can't even say that. He just calls out, "Oh!" And the father hears a familiar voice. "Hey, I know that voice. Where's it coming from?" "It's coming from the border. Let's see who it is. It's my son." And father and child embrace. And we are told the same is true every Rosh Hashanah. God gives us a new year. He gives us 365 days. He says, go out into the world and conquer the world. Become wise and mature. Inspire the world. You are an ambassador of God to bring light and to bring joy, to bring happiness and to bring inspiration to the rest of the world. And what do? We squander the year. Instead of davening and learning Torah and inspiring people and helping people, we eat cheesecake and we eat brownie and we eat ice cream and we sleep all day. We watch movies and Netflix and we forget to do what we have to do. Comes Rosh Hashanah and we forget our language. We forget Hebrew. We forget the mother tongue. We can't even communicate. We say, Abba, Abba, Atzileni, God, save me. Pull me out of my narishkeit. But even that, sometimes you can't say. What do? We blow the shofar. The shofar represents our inner voice. The shofar represents our inner call. The shofar represents our desire to return to our Father, our King. It says the Rebbe, what is the message of this mashal? What is the message of this parable? And there are many, many lessons here. But in this particular Maamar, the Rebbe said that the message here is that the child wants to renew his connection to the king. It's a renewal of the bris, a renewal of the covenant, of the connection that every Yid has with God. That is the meaning of the blowing of the shofar. God, save me. God, I want to renew my connection with you. Mashal Abeis, and then there's a second mashal. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Zal, from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev. Oyev Yisrael Haidu Amafursam, who was a lover of Jews. And it is well known his love for all Yidden. And he was truly the defendant before Almighty God. Every person. In Levushim Shutim, he has another mashal pertaining to the blowing of the shofar of simple garments. Levushim Heim Lamata Mekel Pashut. Simple garments are even less than a calling, a crying from the soul. And these simple garments represent and through these garments one reconnects their connection between the king and their beloved. What is the mashal of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Barditchev? Another beautiful mashal. And that is, there was a king traveling in the forest and he got lost. And he searched and searched and he found a little house, a hut in the middle of the forest. And there was a little person there, a Yid, a pauper who lived in the forest. And the king came in and the king is all wet because he's walking through swamps, he's walking through streams and it's raining and he has no food and he's shivering and he's cold and he's lost. And the pauper tells the king, my dear king, here, take these garments, put them on. He gave him the garments of a pauper. And he gave him a little hay to sleep on. And he gave him a little bit of food, a few beans, a little scrambled eggs. And that's what the king ate for dinner. And he went to sleep. And the next day, he goes back to the palace. And this pauper, this person in the hut, one day, years later, sins before the king. And now the king wants to put him to death. And he comes before the king, and there is a judgment. And the king says, the verdict is you're going to die. You violated the law of the king. Do you have any last requests? And the simpleton tells the king, yes. My last request is I want to give you the garments that you wore the day that you came into my home. And I will put on the garments that I wore the day you met me. That is my last request. And the king puts on those garments. He's reminded of that day when he was lost. He's reminded how this young man spared his life, the life of the king. And now the king forgives him for what he has done. Similarly, says Rabbi Jacob J, God was in the desert. Nobody wanted the Torah. God was homeless. And we, the Jewish people, took him in. We said, yes, we will take your Torah. We will take you as our husband. We shall be your brides. We're a simple people. We came out of Egypt. We were slaves. But you know what? We'll give you what we have. We will dedicate our life to you. And throughout the year, we make mistakes. We violate the Torah. But you know what? The end of the day is, God, put on the garments that you wore the day we saved you, and we will put on our garments. Remember Matan Torah. Remember the beginning of the Torah. Remember we said Naaseh v'nishma. We will do, we will listen. We accepted you unconditionally. Now you accept us unconditionally. And so too, this day of Rosh Hashanah, we ask God to put on those garments. It's a renewal of this connection between God and the Jewish people, a renewal of this covenant between Am Yisrael and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And here the Rebbe says an interesting detail that the garments are even less than the voice of the child. The voice of the child comes from the child's lungs, comes from the child's essence. The garment is also superficial. And yet, even with this superficial garment, which means, God, we're going to change our actions. Garments are the actions. Machshava, dibur, ma'aseh. Thought, speech, and action are the three garments of the soul. We're going to change our garments, and we're going to renew our connection to you. And this becomes now a new covenant. A covenant that never existed before, a greater covenant, a greater love, a greater connection. And now we understand simply the connection between the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah and the blowing of the shofar that was heard on Sinai when God gave us the Torah. As the Abu Draham says, the name of the Rasag, Taimei Atki is one of the reasons. The third reason for why we blow the shofar Rosh Hashanah is a reminder of the shofar blasts that took place on Sinai when God gave us the Torah. As Rabbi Jacob J says, that this is the meaning of the blowing of the shofar Rosh Hashanah. It's the same garment that we had at Sinai, which was the blowing of the shofar. That was the garment. Just like then, when God gave us the Torah and Sinai and he blew the shofar, we can imagine the love and the desire and the determination that God wanted to bring down the Ten Commandments to the Jewish people. He wanted to come down on Sinai and have intimacy with the Jewish people. We can imagine this love and this pleasure in the blowing of that shofar. That is the same pleasure that one derives on the day of Rosh Hashanah when we blow the shofar. Just like the blowing of the shofar and Torah represents the source of pleasure and represents the essence of God coming down on the mountain. As we know in the first of the Ten Commandments, it says, Anochi Hashem Lekecha, Anochi, I am God your Lord, I the essence. Ano Nafshi, I, my soul, Kasavis Yahavis, did I write in the Ten Commandments. That is Ugam, and the same concept applies to Rosh Hashanah. It's God's desire to connect with us. This covenant comes from the level of Atzmos. This renewal of the covenant on Rosh Hashanah it comes from a place of pleasure, comes from a place of God's essence. And the same is true. The idea of blowing the Shofar Rosh Hashanah, which is God's desire to once again recreate the universe and to sustain all the worlds. And God should be king over all the worlds, which takes place through the blowing of the Shofar Inyan Tamluchun Yalechem. Being that everything is returning back to its source. Now, this new blowing of the shofar, this new pleasure, this new desire to create the world also comes from God's essence, the source of all pleasure, the essence of creation, the essence of God. Now we understand why when you read the prayer service of Rosh Hashanah, when we talk about the blowing of the shofar, we talk about Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah on Sinai. And the average person asks the question, why are we talking about Sinai here? It is not the holiday of Shavuos, it's the wrong holiday. That's the holiday when we eat cheesecake. That's the holiday when we have blintzes. Why are we talking about Har Sinai now on the day of Rosh Hashanah, the day of judgment, the first day of creation of man? Rather, we begin Atanigli, so we begin the blessing with God. You revealed yourself on Har Sinai, on the Mount Sinai, Lamed, Lamcha, Torah, mitzvahs to teach the nation, Torah and mitzvahs, Messiah, and we conclude, and we conclude the blessing, Shemeya Kail through us, Amma Yisrael Barachim, here. We say, God, hear the voice of your people, Israel. Hear the voice of the shofar of your people of Israel, Berachamim, with mercy. Similarly, we say in the previous blessing in the Amidah, God remember the covenant. The represents the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And we said, which is in the parasha of Nitzavim, that today you go through this covenant. And the first of the three brachas in the Amidah is Malchus. Simon Mel HaKol, God, you are the king of the entire world. So we have three brachas, three special blessings that we add in the Amidah on Rosh Hashanah and the Moses. And at the end of each of these brachas, we blow the shofar. And this is accomplished by the fact that God is our king. And we accept God as our king. We coronate God as our king. God, you're the king of Israel and the Redeemer. So we see over here that they're all intertwined. One hand, we make God king at Rosh Hashanah by blowing the shofar. Number two is we remember the covenant by blowing the shofar, which every year is a new covenant, a new commitment. What happened last year is out the window. Forget about it. All the mistakes. We're starting all over now anew. And furthermore, the blowing of the shofar reminds us of God's desire to give us the Ten Commandments, God's desire to give us the Torah, the entire Torah on Sinai. And this is also intertwined with this covenant. The covenant that we make on Rosh Hashanah is also to keep the entire Torah. And by doing that, we are making a covenant with God that He is our King. So all of these three brachas are really complementary. They are mutually symbiotic. One complements the other. And one connects with the other. And one perfects the other and beautifies the other. And all of this is done primarily by accepting God as our King. That is the meaning of Mikdash. Now we understand why in the Holy Temple are you taking why they blew the shofar. Even when Rosh Hashanah fell out on Shabbos, on the Indian Rosh Hashanah being that what is the blowing of the shofar? This represents God's love, God's pleasure, the source of pleasure, the source of all pleasure, which is so great and so high that it cannot be manifested and revealed in plain, simple terms. It cannot be manifested simply by eating a piece of brownie. But it's very similar to the blowing of the shofar that was at Matan Torah. Just like at Matan Torah, we know the essence of God came down onto the mountain. The same takes place at Hashanah. When we blow shofar, the essence of God is now telling the world, I love you. I have a desire to connect with you. And I'm going to give you pleasure this year, the source of all pleasure, which will manifest itself in every type of pleasure and every type of goodness. And this pleasure is even higher than the pleasure of Shabbos, even though Shabbos is a day of pleasure. Even if one is able to reach the highest levels of pleasure on Shabbos, however, the blowing of the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash is even greater. Therefore, we need to blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash, even though it fell out on Shabbos, even though Shabbos itself is synonymous with the blowing of the shofar, even though Shabbos itself is pleasure and the blowing of the shofar is pleasure, but yet in the Beis Hamikdash we have the capacity to access a greater level of pleasure, which is the makor, the source of all pleasure. And that's why we blow the shofar there on Shabbos. And the fact that we blew it only in the Beis Hamikdash and nowhere else is very simple, says the Rebbe, is because it depends on the place. In other words, you need to have this access to be able to enter into this place. And only on the Temple Mount, only on Mar Moriah, where Isaac put down his neck to be slaughtered for a sacrifice on that mountain, there we have the ability and the capacity to bring down this new frequency into the world through the blowing of the shofar. And therefore, only in the Beis Hamikdash, the place creates the reality, and there in the Beis Hamikdash you had godliness and revealed state. And it also manifested itself not only in this space, but actually in the stones of Shalabayis of the Holy Temple. Only there does one have the capacity and the possibility to bring down this level of pleasure. Only in the Holy Temple, therefore in the Beis Hamikdash, we blew the shofar. Even when it fell out on Shabbos, because it's higher than Shabbos, and the blowing of the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash is even higher than the pleasure that one derives from Shabbos, even standing in the Beis Hamikdash on Rosh Hashanah. You still need to blow that shofar. By blowing the shofar, we are able to access now this level of divine pleasure. We now continue the final chapter. And just like this was in the Beis Hamikdash, the same is true in the Torah. What does that mean? It states in the Talmud that when the Holy Temple was destroyed, where is God found? God is found only in the 4 cubits of halacha, only in the 4 cubits of Torah. Therefore, we recite the words of Torah on Rosh Hashanah, even when it falls out on Shabbos, even outside of Israel, even in the diaspora. Why? Being that Torah is the Holy Temple. Today, Torah takes the place of the Holy Temple. Today, Torah is synonymous with the Holy Temple. Furthermore, the person who blows the shofar. And the person who hears the shofar also represents the Torah, because there's no free person, only one who is preoccupied with the study of Torah. And therefore, therefore, when a person studies Torah properly, a person now is able, even in exile, even here in Brooklyn Heights, even in Chicago, even in Riverdale, even in Ukraine. If a person is studying Torah, is able to transcend the physical and able to reach a true level of chedus, a true level of freedom. Okay, and therefore, idea is the Torah oisim bedugmas oisa inyan shoya nasa idei ki Hashem. And therefore, today, when unfortunately the temple is not here yet, and we hope by this Rosh Hashanah it will be here, God willing, Amen. By saying the words of Torah pertaining to the psukim, the passages dealing with shofar, it is considered as if you are in the holy temple, and as you are blowing the shofar in the holy temple on Shabbos. And then nase b'simcha gedola, and this is done, even though God forbid we're outside of Israel. We do this with simcha gedola, with tremendous joy. The Admor, as it's expressed in the Maamar of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the point is, when you coronate a king, it is done with tremendous joy. It is not done reluctantly, but rather the entire country goes out, wow, we are so excited to coronate a new king. We love this king. He is so kind. He is so beautiful. He's so handsome. He's so smart. He's so kind. He's so benevolent. He's so merciful. We love this king. And therefore, it's b'simcha gedola. And especially the punchline, when the king is your father. Aren't you joyous? Avinu Malkeinu, our father is the king. So therefore, Rosh Hashanah, we need to be joyous. As the Frierdiker Rebbe explains, and this level of pleasure, and this level which is drawn down, this new flow of energy, this new abundance of light that is derived through the blowing of the shofar, and nowadays through the recital of the verses of the shofar, this represents the ultimate level of tainuk, the ultimate level of pleasure. The Kvei Kedushas Admor Mershab Binyan Tainuk Shuhu Dugmas Bechinas Yom Shekulish Abduch Hailomim. And this pleasure, says the Rebbe here, is a taste of how it's going to be when Mashiach comes, when every single day will be Shabbos, when every single day will be tranquility for all eternity. And being that everything that happens in the higher world is dependent upon you, as we explained earlier in the Maamar from the teachings of the Maggid Mizrach, on the verse or on the statement in Ethics of Our Fathers. Dama l'mayla mimach, know that which is above you. Everything in heaven comes from you. If you're in a good mood, in heaven is a good mood. If you're kind and doing acts of kindness, in heaven now, there's a reflection. It mirrors your actions. And therefore he says the Rebbe, that every single Yid has the power. It doesn't matter if you're a giant or if you're a midget in Judaism. It doesn't matter if you know a lot of Torah or you know a little Torah. We are all children of God. We are all princes and princesses. And therefore we have the king in us. Therefore he says every Yid has the power. Not only can we effectuate all the lower worlds, but we have the power to access this level of divine pleasure. The source of all pleasure, the absolute pleasure, And this now is drawn down to the world. As we say, God become king, bestow your kingship upon all the worlds and your honor and your glory. And therefore every creation, every existence will know that you were the one that brought them into existence. Not only is it true for all the nations of the world, but surely for the Israelites, for the Jewish people, God will become king, not only for the entire world, but in particular for Am Yisrael. And this will lead us to the ultimate redemption. To the coming of Mashiach, for then, Yitku Gambi Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashanah, Shechali is Mishabed the Beis Hamikdash. For when Mashiach will come, we will surely blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash, even when it falls out in Shabbos. Ubi Yavne, and also in Yavne. The Gam B'chol Mokim Mokim, and says the Rebbe here that when Mashiach will come, we will also blow the shofar in every synagogue, in every location, when Rosh Hashanah falls out in Shabbos. Why? Because it's battle call and Yom Gazedis. So then the reason why we don't blow shofar will be nullified. We're going to remove all of these boundaries. The concern of why we don't blow shofar is because perhaps you will carry the shofar in a public domain. We're not going to be worried about that mistake when Mashiach comes. And therefore, we're going to have the capacity, we're going to have the capability, we're going to have the privilege to blow the shofar everywhere, in every synagogue, in every Chabad house, in every home, and every street corner. Even when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, if there's an Eidiv in the community, and this should be done very swiftly, very soon, with tremendous joy. So what do we see here from the mind? Number one, Rosh Hashanah is true, is a day of judgment. Becomes a law Chassidus and infuses the day with the day of pleasure. It's also a day of pleasure. And it's also a day of tremendous joy because we are coronating God as king. And when you coronate the king gives gifts to everybody who's standing there coronating him. So it's a day of divine gifts, a day of divine pleasure. And ultimately, even the judgment. Who is making the judgment? Avinu Malkeinu, our Father is the judge. Now, let me ask you a question. If your Father is the judge, don't you think he's going to be merciful? Of course he is. So therefore, be joyous and be in a state of divine pleasure. And this will create a reaction in the higher worlds, which will therefore reflect your love and your joy and your passion and your pleasure. And then God will have that pleasure and he will reflect that back again into the world. And therefore, all of us will have God's divine pleasure and God's divine joy and all of the gifts that God will bestow upon us for this year. To have a Shana Tova Masukah, to have a year that is truly good and a year that is truly sweet. Already from the 15th day of Av, which is this coming evening, we begin to wish one the other a Ksiva V'Chsima Tova, of the Shana Tova Masukah to be written and to be sealed for a happy and healthy, sweet new year. And a year that is full of pleasure, divine pleasure and physical pleasure. A year that is full of tremendous simcha gedola, tremendous joy. And a year that is filled with tremendous parnasa b'achava, tremendous sustenance and God's gifts, materially and spiritually, and the ultimate year. The year when God will blow the shofar gadol, the big shofar, and bring back all of the exiles to Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, the third holy temple, b'meira b'yameinu, amen.